Folks, I need to address something that happened following my recent video about Hannah Duston. I don't normally make videos responding to individual commenters. In fact, I encourage disagreement on this channel. History requires disagreement. Historians debate sources. Genealogists challenge conclusions. Researchers discover new evidence. Two people can examine the same 17th century document and reach entirely different interpretations. And that is historical discussion. But what happened in the comments section of this recent video was not historical or scholarly discussion. In fact, it became personal. It became an attempt to intimidate me. And in my view, it crossed the line into cyberbullying. The comments in question were reported, and YouTube subsequently removed them. And I want to explain why I believe this distinction matters, not simply for me, but for the kind of community that I want Trace Your New England Roots to remain. Someone strongly disagreed with how I presented the story of Hannah Duston, and that is fine. Seriously, it's fine. If you believe that I have interpreted a historical source incorrectly, tell me. If you have a primary source that I have not considered, show it to me. If you believe that another historian has reached a stronger conclusion than me, then give me the citation. I have spent years researching genealogy and New England history, and I know perfectly well that historical conclusions can change when new evidence emerges. And and that is just simply scholarship. But that is not what happened here. Instead, this commenter accused me of lying. This person called me, quote, a disgusting rewriter of history. They claimed that I changed Hannah Duston's story just simply to promote my, quote, sick book. And they went as far as to call me a monster. And they encouraged other people to report me. Then the behavior extended beyond this simple comment. They began responding to other people throughout the thread. And at that point, this was no longer someone simply challenging a historical interpretation. It appeared to be an effort to discredit, shame, and intimidate the person presenting the history. And there is an enormous difference between saying, you know, Eric, I believe you're wrong, and here's the evidence, and saying, you're disgusting, you're a liar, you're a monster, everyone should report you. One is debate, and the other is just simply personal harassment. Now, let's talk about the actual history, because that is where this conversation should have remained. Hannah Duston's story is extraordinarily complicated. In March 1697, during King William's War, Haverhill, Massachusetts was attacked. Hannah had recently given birth to her daughter. She and her nurse, Mary Neff, were among those who were taken captive. According to the historical accounts, Hannah's newborn daughter, Martha, was killed during the forced march north. And That's horrifying. I've never denied it. I've never attempted to sensationalize nor minimize it. And anyone telling Hannah Duston's story responsibly should acknowledge it. But something else happened later. Hannah and Mary eventually found themselves with a smaller native group, along with a young English captive named Samuel Leonardson. Hannah, Mary, and Samuel ultimately killed 10 people while they slept and escaped. And among those killed were children. And I didn't invent that. I didn't add children to the story just to make Hannah Duston look evil. And I certainly did not rewrite Hannah's history just to sell a novel. That information comes from the historical traditions surrounding the event itself. And folks, this is where historical literacy becomes extremely important. Our knowledge of Hannah Duston comes through 17th century sources that themselves have to be evaluated critically. Samuel Sewall recorded information concerning Hannah shortly after her return. Cotton Mather subsequently published an account and transformed Hannah's experience into a religious narrative. The Massachusetts government rewarded Hannah Duston, Mary Neff, and Samuel Leonardson. Then subsequent generations repeatedly reinterpreted Hannah. She became a frontier heroine. She became a symbol of courage and an avenging mother, and much later, a symbol for some historians and Native communities of colonial violence. So when somebody tells you there is one simple, undisputed version of Hannah Duston's story, we need to be careful, because there isn't. There are things that we can document. There are things reported by contemporary or near contemporary sources. There are details whose reliability can legitimately be questioned, and there are interpretations developed generations afterward. And understanding those distinctions is what historians are supposed to do. This commenter claimed that the people Hannah killed were just simply a war party, and that characterization itself requires historical scrutiny. The group included men, women, and children. So what relationship individual members of that group had to Hannah's original capture, the behavioral attack, or the killing of her infant is precisely the kind of question historians should investigate rather than just assume. And that's where I would have welcomed a discussion. Show me the evidence. Which primary source establishes the claim? When was it written? Who wrote it? How close was that person to the event? Was the writer an eyewitness? Was the account written decades later? Does another contemporary source contradict it? Folks, that's historical methodology. Calling me a monster is not. There's another important principle here. Studying history does not require us to choose teams. Acknowledging what happened to Hannah Duston does not require minimizing what happened to Native people. And acknowledging Native suffering does not require pretending that English colonists were not also subjected to horrific violence. This was a brutal period of frontier war. Families were killed, homes were burned, people were taken captive, Native communities were devastated, English communities were attacked, children suffered on both sides. People were displaced, enslaved, traumatized, and killed. History becomes propaganda when we decide beforehand which group is allowed to be a victim and which group is allowed to be a perpetrator. Real history is usually much more uncomfortable than that. And that's particularly important to me because this channel is built around telling people, is not based around what people want to hear. It's about genealogy. It's about discovering who these people actually were. Now, many of you have written to me about discovering your ancestors connected to King Philip's War, the Salem witch trials, colonial conflict, immigration, slavery, native communities, military service, and countless other difficult chapters of American history. Sometimes we discover ancestors who did extraordinary things, and yet sometimes we discover ancestors who did terrible things. Sometimes we discover people whose actions simply cannot be judged through a comfortable 21st century category. Our responsibility is not to protect them. It is not to prosecute them. Our responsibility is to understand them. And that is why I reported these comments, not just because someone disagreed with me. Folks, I will never report somebody merely because they tell me that I'm wrong. But when disagreement becomes repeated personal attacks, when someone calls the creator a liar, disgusting, and a monster, encourages other people to report that creator, and then moves through the comment thread responding to other participants in an apparent effort to discredit and intimidate, that is no longer the historical conversation I am willing to host. The comments were reported. YouTube removed them. And I think there's an important lesson in that. You don't have to agree with me to participate here. You don't have to like my conclusions. You don't even have to like my books. You don't even have to like me. But you do have to treat other members of this community with basic respect. So I want to say something directly to anyone who strongly disagrees with something that I present. Challenge me. Bring the receipts, bring the documents, bring the citations, bring the scholarship. Tell me exactly what I got wrong. And if you demonstrate that I've indeed made a factual error, of course I'll correct her. I've corrected. I've done that before, and I'll do it again. Because correcting an error does not weaken a historian or genealogist. Refusing to correct one does. But personal insults are not evidence. Name calling is not a citation. Encouraging a group of people to report someone isn't peer review. Following people through a comment thread to attack the creator is not historical methodology. And intimidation doesn't become scholarship simply because the argument happens to concern history. And before I say anything else, I want to make something very clear. I do not want this video to be retaliatory. I don't want to send people after this commenter. I don't want anyone searching for their account, attacking them, or responding to them on my behalf. And I don't want to reward bad behavior by giving it more attention than it deserves. And in fact, there is another reason I'm reluctant to simply dismiss what they had to say. This commenter is obviously deeply invested in Hannah Duston's history. She may have a family connection to the story. She may have encountered family records, traditions, research, or sources that I have not seen. If they have evidence that challenges something I've presented, genuinely I want to see it. Because that is what historians and genealogists are supposed to do. We follow the evidence. But unfortunately, that's not where this exchange remained, and a line was crossed. And I've decided to talk about it because what happened illustrates a larger problem that virtually every genealogist or family historian will eventually encounter. What happens when the evidence contradicts the family story that someone has believed their entire life? If you've researched genealogy long enough, you've probably experienced this yourself. Maybe your family always said your ancestor came over on the Mayflower, and then the records demonstrate that they didn't. Maybe generations of relatives believe that they descended from a particular Native American ancestor, and then either the documentary research or DNA evidence challenged that tradition. Maybe someone was supposedly a Revolutionary War hero, but the military records tell a considerably more complicated story. Or perhaps an ancestor remembered for generations as an innocent victim turns out to have participated in something deeply troubling. Those discoveries can be very painful, because genealogy isn't like researching strangers. These are our families. Family stories become our part of our identities. They are passed from grandparents to grandchildren until eventually the distinction between this is what our family has always said and this is what the evidence demonstrates can disappear. And when someone challenges that story, it can feel as though they are challenging you. And that's where we have to be especially careful. That's part of the reason why I initially hesitated to respond to this. They clearly feel very strongly about Hannah Duston, and I respect that investment. But instead of simply challenging my interpretation, they accused me of lying. They called me disgusting. They called me a monster. And they announced that they reported me and encouraged everyone else in the thread to report me as well. And then they began responding to other people throughout the comment thread. And at that point, this wasn't simply, Eric, you're wrong about Hannah Duston, and here's why. That would have been completely acceptable. Instead, the disagreement became personal. And it then became an attempt of intimidation and cyberbullying. Those comments were reported to YouTube, and as I said, they were removed. And I'm not mentioning this to triumphantly. I'm mentioning it because there is an important distinction between challenging someone's research and attacking the researcher. But here's where I think both historians and genealogists need some humility. Our surviving accounts of Hannah Duston are not perfect windows into 1697. Samuel Sewall recorded information concerning Hannah's story shortly after her turn. Cotton Mather subsequently published his account and interpreted Hannah's experience through his own religious and cultural worldview. The Massachusetts government rewarded Hannah Duston, Mary Neff, and Samuel Leonardson. And over the next 3 centuries, Hannah's story was repeatedly retold. She became a frontier heroine, an avenging mother, a symbol of courage, and much later, a symbol to some historians and Native communities of colonial violence. So again, when somebody claims there is one simple, completely undisputed version, we need to be cautious. There are facts supported by contemporary evidence. There are statements made by historical participants. And there are later traditions. There are interpretations. And there are questions that may never be answered conclusively. Knowing the difference is fundamental to historical research. The commenter maintained that those Hannah killed constituted a war party. That's just a historical claim. So let's examine it historically. What evidence identifies every member of that particular group as belonging to a war party responsible for the attack? What evidence connects individual members of that group to the killing of Hannah's infant? Who recorded that evidence? When? When was that person an eyewitness? Is there corroborating evidence? And if this commenter possesses a source that answers those questions, I do want to see it. Because They may know something I don't. And that's entirely possible. No serious genealogist should ever believe they've seen every document. And this brings me to the reason I'm making this video. Imagine you're a professional genealogist. A client hires you to investigate their great-great-grandfather. They tell you the family story. You begin researching, and then you discover something that's completely different. And then now imagine presenting that conclusion to someone whose grandmother told them the opposite when they were a child. You're not merely challenging a genealogical conclusion anymore. In their mind, you're challenging grandma. You might be challenging their father, their family identity, their heritage. Perhaps even something they have proudly repeated for over 50 years. And that can produce an intensely emotional reaction. And that is why genealogists have a tremendous responsibility. And then we need to be respectful. We need to explain our reasoning. We need to distinguish between what we know, what we believe, and what we simply just cannot establish from the surviving evidence. And most importantly, folks, we need to remain open to being wrong. If somebody presents a document tomorrow demonstrating that I've gotten this element of Hannah Duston's story wrong, then I'll examine it. If it's credible, I'll correct my work. It's not embarrassing. That's research. Genealogy is not about proving that we are right. It's about getting as close to the truth as the surviving evidence allows. But that responsibility must work both ways. If a genealogist presents evidence that contradicts a family tradition, challenge the evidence, ask questions, find another record, seek a second opinion, examine the citations, show where the reasoning fails, but don't attack the researcher. Calling someone a liar isn't evidence. Calling someone disgusting isn't a citation. Calling someone a monster does not resolve a conflict between historical sources. Encouraging everyone in a discussion to report someone is not peer review. And repeatedly confronting other participants within a comment thread is not a substitute for producing evidence. So when disagreement turns into an attempt to silence or intimidate the person presenting an unwanted conclusion, we have left historical discussion behind. And I want to emphasize something else. Please do not attack this commenter. Don't search for them. Don't respond to them. Don't retaliate on my behalf. It's precisely the cycle that I'm trying to discourage. They clearly care deeply about this history. And I would much rather see that passion turn toward finding and sharing evidence. And if they possess information I haven't seen, the door always remains open for a respectful discussion. But personal attacks and attempts to intimidate people in Trace New England roots is not acceptable. This isn't really a video about one YouTube comment. It's about something every genealogist eventually learns. And that is that the past does not always cooperate with the stories that families tell about it. Sometimes grandma was right. Sometimes the family Bible was right and the official record was wrong. Sometimes an oral tradition preserves something extraordinary that eventually leads us to evidence. And sometimes a beloved family story simply doesn't survive. And our job isn't to destroy those stories. It isn't to blindly defend them either. Our job is to investigate them. Hannah Duston deserves that same treatment. We can acknowledge the killing of her infant daughter. We can acknowledge the trauma of captivity. We can examine why Hannah believed she needed to escape. And we can simultaneously confront the historical accounts telling us that children were among the 10 people killed during that escape. One truth doesn't erase another. History does not require us to choose a team. It requires us to follow the evidence. So if you disagree with something I present, please challenge me. Bring me your documents. Bring me your citations. And bring me the family Bible nobody has examined in 100 years. You might have something I've never seen, and you might change my mind. That's one of the most exciting things about genealogy. But let's challenge evidence with evidence and interpretations with interpretations, because disagreement can make historical research stronger. Personal attacks cannot. And whether we're investigating Hannah Duston, King Philip's War, or just our own great-great-grandparents, we should all be pursuing the same thing, not the version of history that we inherited, not the version that we wish were true, but the version that the evidence can actually support. And now I want to hear from you. If you're a genealogist or family historian, have you ever discovered evidence that contradicted a story your family had believed for generations? Maybe you discovered that an ancestor wasn't who the family thought they were. Maybe a treasured story turned out to be partially true, but not quite the way it had been passed down. Or maybe you found a document that completely changed how you what you understood of them. How did you handle that discovery? And if you shared it with your family, how did they respond? Tell me about that in the comments. And I'd especially like to hear from other genealogists. How do you present difficult or unexpected evidence to a client or family member when you know it may challenge something that they've believed their entire life? Let's make the comments on this video an example of what good historical discussion can actually look like, different from the last one. Because some of the best genealogical discoveries begin with 5 simple words. What does the evidence say? If you believe genealogy should be about following the evidence wherever it leads, then I hope you'll join this growing community. Please like this video. It helps the YouTube algorithm know that family historians and genealogists like you find it worth sharing. And if you're new here, subscribe to Trace Your New England Roots and turn on the notifications. We explore the records, people, mysteries, conflicts, and forgotten stories that shape New England and show you how to uncover those stories in your own family tree. And if you'd like to go deeper, you can join my Substack where I provide access to exclusive content. The records are still there. The stories are still waiting to be discovered. Let's follow the evidence and uncover the stories that our ancestors have left behind. Thanks for watching. Until next time, this is Eric with Trace Your New England Roots, where history starts with your family.